When I was 21 years old, my ichthyology professor, Dr. Underhill, talked about how the properties of water make life possible. And I didn't really understand that until I started studying a little more chemistry. So in this series of demonstrations, I'm going to show you the properties of water that make life possible.
Have you ever taken for granted the fact that you can pour water through a spout? Or drink water? Or the sugary solution of maple syrup derived from maple sap? Or the fact that trees can grow tall? Or that we can pee? This all comes from the properties of the water molecule. And water has all kinds of cool properties that make life possible because it is two hydrogens bonded to one oxygen, and that hydrogen has one proton and one circulating electron, and oxygen has 8 protons and 8 circulating electrons, and ultimately they're going to share electrons, and they're going to build a water molecule, H2O, 2 hydrogens, 1 oxygen. That bond angle is going to be 104.5 degrees, which gives it a unique geometry, we could say. And it also has charged ends, and that's going to be pretty important to remember. We call that a polar covalent bond, and we'll get into how that works in just a second. But the hydrogens and the oxygen share electrons. Now here's a simpler sharing game. This is the molecule methane, CH4, and in this case we have a carbon which can make 4 covalent bonds, and it's sharing its electrons with 4 hydrogens. So let's talk about covalent bonds and how they work in biology. Here's the challenge. I have an electron and I need an electron. You have an electron and you need an electron. Well, how can we give yet not lose? How can we receive yet not harm? How are we going to make this work? Let's think about this as a challenge. Can you guess what's going to happen? So let's say this quarter represents my electron, and I have an electron, but my empty hand represents a need. And I have a partner here. My partner also has a quarter and an empty hand. How can we give each other a quarter and receive a quarter without losing our quarter? Just like this. It's sharing. So this is how a covalent bond works. The 2 atoms circulate and share the electrons. In doing so, they bond, so they're bonded in electron clouds, and that creates a very stable, strong bond. Most biological molecules are built of these very strong sharing covalent bonds. Now water's a little bit strange though, because the oxygen has a really big electron orbital circulating around the inner stable orbital, and then the hydrogens are very, very small. So as they circulate, you'll notice that we see some positive charges popping up whenever those hydrogens are completely devoid of electrons. And then on the bottom you see a little negative that pops up a lot as the oxygen actually has more electrons. So when we get 8 electrons in the outer orbital of oxygen, we have a total of 10 electrons for 8 protons. That's a net negative charge. And out there on the hydrogen ends, when we lose our electrons, then all we are is a proton, and we have a net positive charge. So you can see that over time we're getting a lot of positive charges up there on the hydrogen end of things, and a pretty consistent negative charge on the oxygen end of things. So we're getting a positive and negative polar. That's the polar covalent bond. So what starts to happen is the water molecules, oxygens with a negative charge, are attracted to another water molecule's positive end. And so we see that water has order, and it's a very dynamic and changing order, but nonetheless it's an order of positives attracting negatives, negatives attracting positives. So the polar bond, a way to remember this is it kind of looks like a polar bear. We've got the positive hydrogens and the negative oxygen. Life began in water. Water's polar covalent bonds support all cell processes and make life possible. Alright, so I'm going to show you an experiment you can do at home, which is really cool. We're going to pick up these paper clips and bend a little part. They got to be the small paper clips. Remember, paper clips are metal and they're more dense than water, so they should sink, right? But I'm going to place the paperclip on the meniscus of water here, and look at that, it floats. So this is water's cohesive properties. Cohesion and surface tension result from the polar covalent bonds of the positive charges and negative charges interacting. I'm going to try this again, and whoops. You can see that the paperclips actually do sink, so this isn't a trick. As the negatively charged oxygens connect with the positively charged hydrogens of an adjacent water molecule, they create this surface tension from cohesion. Water sticks to water. So I'm going to try this experiment again. Let's see what happens if I'm successful with both paperclips. Put the first one on. Look at that surface tension. And you can also see it seems to be attracted to the side of the jar. So I'm guessing water molecules are pulling on water molecules. And so eventually things are going to bump into each other and they're going to get stuck by that cohesive force. I succeeded. I've got 2 paperclips floating. What happens if I push the paperclips closer together? Will they sink or will they float? Look at that. They actually stick together. And so what's happening now, and stuck completely together. So we've got this adhesive, cohesive property from the polar covalent bonds of water, and you can really see that surface tension now. There's absolutely no way I'm going to be able to pull these 2 paperclips apart without sinking them. So now I've got myself a little bit of a catamaran boat here. Try this at home. It's really fun. I filled this up all the way to the point where I have a meniscus, and that meniscus is the surface tension of the water rising above the jar. You can also see because of cohesion, I can bend water. So as I pour it out into the sink, I'm actually moving my finger around and I can control the direction. All right, canola oil, great for cooking and dressings, but definitely not water. Oil is a nonpolar molecule. And so what we're going to find here is that oil and water do not mix. A polar will not mix with a nonpolar. So as I pour this in, you can see those globules forming. And because the oil is less dense than the water it's floating, look carefully at those globules and you find out that all the water molecules are separating away from the oil molecules, creating a membrane. And it turns out cells have membranes that are lipids. They're oils. And so a cell membrane, much like we see here, can be used to separate the contents of the cell from its aqueous external environment. Well, if it's not cohesive, then what happens when I put the paperclip on it? It's not going to float, is it? Down it goes. With so much less surface tension, there's no cohesion between the molecules. When I try my paperclip trick, it doesn't work so well. Let's try again, just to make sure I wasn't too rough with the thing. And down it goes. So you can't float the paperclip on the oil the way you can on the water because it doesn't have the surface tension, because it doesn't have the polar covalent bonds. The properties of lipids are very important in how cell membranes work in separating the cell's contents from the external environment. They're also problematic in digestion, and your liver will actually emulsify fats physically so that the smaller fat components can be absorbed through digestion. But you can see once again I stirred it up and all the water gets kicked out and that lipid all joins back together. Water travels up and up and up into plants through adhesion and capillary action. So because of the cohesive nature of water, water sticks to water, and the adhesive nature, water sticks to other things, water can move through capillary action through little narrow tubes called xylem tubes from an area of high water concentration to an area of lower water concentration, even all the way up to the top of a tree from the rainwater that landed on the ground and entered the roots and moved into the tree. So as water sticks to water, water will move up and up and up into the canopy of the forest. So this again is called capillary action, where the water is going to cling to the walls of xylem tube. Now some plants don't have vascular tissue, like these ancient liverwort moss, and studies have shown that they can be at most 6 centimeters high. After 6 centimeters, without that capillary action, we can't beat gravity. And so tall plants need to have thin chambers in which the water can respond both by its cohesive and adhesive nature. Here's an example of adhesion. If you look at the spoon, I've got the water trying to drip off the end, but it sticks to the spoon. And that is the adhesive property. Because water is cohesive and adhesive, I can also use a spout. And you may have seen like your grandma or grandpa pouring water across a knife. This is similar. To keep the water from drizzling all over the place, you give it something to stick to. Here's an example of spilling without the knife. No worries. Because of the cohesive and adhesive nature, I can also take a dry paper towel and I can wipe it up because the water is going to move from high to low concentration into the fibers of the towel. So there, no problem. Hey, I cleaned the table too. All right, so let's look at the capillary action idea here with some celery. Now, celery is a really good candidate. If you've ever crunched into celery, what makes celery so crunchy is the xylem tubes, those vascular tubes that you got to bite through, and then also some crunchy parenchyma cells. All right, so here are those xylem tubes. Look at those fibers. Man, you could like make shoes out of that or something. So I'm going to pull this out of here so we can think about that these are the water transport tubes that take the water from the roots of the plant all the way up into the leaves. So I'm going to do a little experiment. I'm going to pour some blue dye into some water here with my celery, and I'm going to let it sit for a while. And what's going to happen, you've probably seen this in maybe grade school, is the blue dye is going to start moving up into the xylem tubes. And I've cut a section here so you can see, didn't have the patience to let it go overnight. And you can see that that blue dye is moving up through the xylem tubes. If I let it sit a couple of nights, I'll probably have some blue leaves. Now look at that. A microscopic section shows those little tiny straws. If I cut a carrot, which is actually a taproot, I would expect to find a similar vasculature. And so when you look inside a carrot, you're actually going to find these small capillary action tubes. So looking at this, you can see these little tiny circular capillary tubes running through the taproot of the carrot. So water transport systems in vascular plants depend on the adhesive and cohesive nature of water's polar covalent bonds. Water tends to move from high to low concentration on a concentration gradient. What this means is it goes from areas of great abundance to areas of scarcity. So water is constantly in motion. The liquid and gas states of water will always diffuse through their environment. In this case, I have a model cell, and it's dialysis tubing filled with a starchy solution. And that starch solution doesn't have very much water by percent. On the outside, I have an iodine solution that I've poured in, which is very, very dilute, very watery. When the iodine reaches the starch, it turns this beautiful midnight blue black color, and so you can see the water is diffusing from high to low concentration, going through the cell membrane and into the starchy solution. Well, it turns out that plants use this diffusion and osmosis all the time to move water through their tissues. Because water moves from high to low concentration through the tissues of a plant, a vascular plant has a pretty cool trick it can do, and it uses something called a stoma. Stoma is the Greek word for mouth, so these are the little mouths on the underside of a plant's leaves. Vascular plants use a stoma to take carbon dioxide in for the purpose of securing that carbon dioxide and making sugars and photosynthesis. And they also tend to lose water through evaporative transpiration. That evaporative transpiration is actually a pretty cool little trick because remember, water goes from high to low concentration. So if the leaf loses water, then the water molecules are going to follow that gradient and fill the leaf from the stem of the leaf, which will be replaced by water from the deeper down stems of the plant, and the water will creep up and up and up in replacement, just like this diffusion and osmosis, from the pure waters of the soil into the roots, up into the shoots, out into the leaves, and then out into the atmosphere. Water continues to move through a plant. There was one study that shows an oak tree can move as much as 80,000 gallons of water per year. Another study shows that the relative humidity of forests is actually higher than that of the surrounding landscapes. And this is because trees are moving so much water through their vascular tissue and evaporating out the stomata that they're actually creating a microclimate in the forest. Let's look at another property of water that makes life possible, that of water being the universal solvent. So what that means is that all polar molecules like sugar will dissolve in water, and all salts will dissolve in water. When salts dissolve in water, they become electrolytes, so they will actually conduct electrical charge. This weak electrical charge is important in muscle movement, in how nerves and muscles work together, and they'll also dissolve sugars, which makes water a very important transport medium. Think about, for example, the sap of a maple tree or the blood flowing through our veins. All of these water transport systems, be it blood or sap, are moving critical nutrients from point A to point B, delivering the goods to cells. When we tap maple trees, we're actually taking the lifeblood of the maple, in small quantities of course, as a small parasitic gesture, and we are actually going to boil that down and get the sugars that'll nourish us later. We're leaving plenty for the maple tree to nourish itself. When we're boiling maple syrup, what we are really doing is evaporating the pure water from the sugary transport medium of sap. Thanks to that universal solvent, we get all the sugary goodness. And as we pour that off and then bring it to stovetop and finish it and boil it down, we're making something that's about, they call it 68% legal sugar. We've boiled a lot of the pure water away. Blood is important as a transport medium as well, and our digestive systems, and here we see a frog's digestive system, are actually really well hooked up with blood vessels that nourish the smooth muscles of the digestive tract so that it can do work, nourishing it with sugars and oxygen from our artery system, and also hooked up with a whole bunch of veins to absorb nutrients from the intestine and transport those nutrients by the beating of the heart to all the cells of the body. Of interest is that your blood moves through your kidneys once every 3 minutes, your entire blood volume, 20 times per hour. That allows you to regulate the water balance of your blood, and well, that's where P comes from. Because water is a universal solvent, it also allows food particles to diffuse towards the nose of a curious turtle, or molecules of prey to be detected by a fish or a shark. Now here's another experiment which is really interesting. It also shows that the temperature is important in the rate of molecular diffusion. So these substances are going to move faster in warm water than in cold. If you've ever seen a turtle basking on a log, think about the water inside the turtle's body. As the turtle heats up that water, it's going to increase the rate of molecular diffusion, and that's going to allow a lot of the chemical processes of the turtle to happen faster. So they're cold-blooded animals, and when they're out basking in the sun, they're boosting the rate of diffusion, and that helps with their metabolism, that helps keep the cells alive. Another way that the properties of water are important for life on Earth.
On a day like today, you can find water in all of its states, solid, liquid, and gas. And what's great is you can actually see the gas as sublimation, as fog lifts from the solid state directly to the gaseous state, skipping that liquid state in between.
Water resists temperature change, and this is because of its polar covalent bonds. And this is also one more property that makes life possible, the resistance to temperature change. If I jump into a hot sauna and then jump out into a cold snowbank, I'm not really going to change my body temperature a whole lot. I have to sit in the sauna for a long time, or really sit down for a long time in that snow. A watch teapot never boils, right? Well, it actually does. It's taking some time. When water hits 100 degrees Celsius, it finally boils. The water closest to the heat source is changing from liquid to vapor first, and so that then rises up through the column, and that creates those bubbles of boiling. So here you can see I put some water in an ice cube tray, and I put it in the freezer. I'm going to make some ice cubes. But I return about an hour later, and I find that there's still water inside my ice cubes. Water resists temperature change. So it takes a long time for water to freeze as well. And this is important because water resists temperature change. Animals that live in northern climates are able to resist freezing. Speaking of northern climates, a lot of animals live underwater. And here I finally got my frozen ice cubes, and what you'll see is that water is actually less dense as a solid. It floats on liquid water, and that's pretty unusual among compounds. A lot of things, like for example, let's think of liquid metal. If I was to put solid metals into the liquid of their same metallic type, I would end up with the solids sinking, because solids are generally more dense than liquids, but solid water is less dense than liquid water. It has to do with the way the polar covalent bonds work and the geometry of those water molecules. Remember early on how they stack up with negatives to positives? So the less dense water floating on top of the more dense liquid water allows living things to survive underneath in the water. In northern climates, that's really huge. When a lake completely freezes to the bottom, it's absolutely catastrophic to the life inside. Life originated in water, and in northern climates, the fact that water is less dense as a solid is really important to keeping life going. Every once in a while in cold climates, water will crystallize in the cells of a cold-blooded organism and kill it. In northern climates, many cold-blooded species, from frogs to various types of insects, have really neat adaptations for preventing freezing to death. Have you ever noticed that when you put salt in water, it freezes at a lower temperature? Dissolving substances in water will actually lower the freezing point, and many animals, including snow fleas, have a similar system going on in their body. They'll break down sugars and circulate those partially broken sugars as antifreeze. If you're ever going for a hike in the cold north woods of the Great Lakes area, you can see snow fleas. They're actually these little springtails, columbola. They're alive and well all winter long.
Water is all around us. Hopefully it's clean water, hopefully it's useful water, water that provides for wildlife, water that provides for the plants around us, water that cycles naturally and keeps us healthy and clean.
Remember, life began in water. Water is life. To pollute water is to destroy life. The cells of every living thing rely on the properties of water. The properties of water that make life possible result from polar covalent bonds, and they include cohesion and surface tension, adhesion and capillary action, osmotic potential and movement from high to low concentration in liquid and gas state. Water is a universal solvent, dissolving polar molecules and salts and acting as a transport medium such as sap or blood. Water is readily found in nature in three states: solid, liquid, and gas. Water is resistant to temperature change. Water is less dense as a solid. And water doesn't mix with nonpolar molecules such as fats, which allows cell membranes to do their jobs. The properties of water make life possible. Dr. James Underhill was definitely right. Thanks, Dr. Underhill.